What up, folks? It's your boy Trails, and we back with another one. Make sure you hit that like and sub. And we got some breaking news to report on. Daniel Penny acquitted of criminally negligent homicide after more serious manslaughter charge dismissed. Now we're going to go ahead and listen to this report on it, and then we'll give our opinions on the situation and take it from there. Let's go ahead and see what MSNBC got to say about it.
We also have some new breaking news as the jury has just come to a unanimous decision in the Daniel Penny case. And NBC's Antonia Hilton is outside the courthouse for us. MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin is here with us. Antonia, walk us through the verdict and where this takes us in the case.
Hey, Anna, the verdict from the jury is that Daniel Penny has been found not guilty, and that is of the second lesser charge that he was facing, which was criminally negligent homicide. This is after the events of last week. This jury, made up of an anonymous group of 7 women, 5 men, were deadlocked on the initial manslaughter charge.
So initially they were deadlocked on the manslaughter. The judge removed the manslaughter for a lesser charge, and now they have come back and deliberated not guilty of that lesser charge. So this is pretty much what's going on.
Prosecutors then asked the judge to dismiss that so the jury could move to considering this second lesser felony. And the jury has now come back after, only about an hour of discussion with this not guilty verdict. They spent more than 23 hours in deliberations over this case that has become something of a fault line here in the New York area. And we're incredibly conscientious throughout the process. In fact, they sent numerous notes back to the judge to ask for clarifications, additional explanations, to review evidence one more time and testimony one more time. And that's really a reflection of just the difficulty, the sort of discussion and debate that's happened in this city at large. Some arguing
I don't know about much difficulty, but yeah, so pretty much they needed a back and forth with the judge to understand the situation
here in New York, that Daniel Penny is a hero who took necessary action that day in May of 2023. Prosecutors say that he held Jordan Neely in a chokehold for about 6 minutes, and people who have supported him said that he was protecting his fellow New Yorkers who experienced sort of unpredictable and sometimes frightening incidents on public transportation here. And then others, you may be able to hear behind me here that there's a crowd of protesters that have gathered here to support Jordan Neely. They see this as a case that is about social justice, racial justice in New York City, the lack of support for people suffering with mental health challenges, the lack of support for people who are experiencing homelessness, all of which deeply impacted Jordan Neely for many years leading up to his death. And so this is certainly going to continue to be an emotional and charged moment here in the city. And in fact, our team on the inside of the courtroom says that upon hearing the verdict, people were immediately emotional. His supporters cheering and relieved, and others just absolutely devastated, immediately crying, some escorted out of the court because of their reactions, Anna.
A lot of us already pretty much expected this when they removed the more serious charge, because that's the one that was deadlocked on. And then after they removed that one, it only took an hour of deliberating the lesser charge to come back not guilty. So we could already see that the fix was in, and it's actually pretty sad. But let's go ahead and let this continue.
Yeah, we are learning Jordan Neely's father is among those who were tossed out of the courtroom for yelling, we are told, according to our reporters who were inside the courtroom. Lisa, talk to us about the evidence that we saw come out during this trial that may have led to this verdict.
Well, first of all, Anna, there were more than 40 witnesses over the course of the trial, including people who experienced these events in real time, sitting on the same subway car, some of whom testified that they were indeed afraid of Jordan Neely as this episode unfolded. That may have had an impact on the jury, which was asked to assess, with respect to both of the counts that they were asked to consider, whether or not the district attorney's office had proven beyond a reasonable doubt that there was no justification for what Daniel Penny had done. So these two counts, manslaughter was the first count, criminally negligent homicide was the other, were presented to the jury in the alternative, meaning you could only find a guilty verdict as to one. If they had found...
So wait a minute, let's go back and hear that what she just said.
On the jury, which was asked to assess with respect to both of the counts that they were asked to consider, whether or not the district attorney's office had proven beyond a reasonable doubt that there was no justification for what Daniel Penny had done. So these two counts, manslaughter was the first count, criminally negligent homicide was the other, were presented to the jury in the alternative, meaning you could only find a guilty verdict as to one. If they had...
You hear that? So this sounds like a little manipulation. Why would they only be allowed to find a guilty verdict in one? That doesn't make any sense.
Manslaughter was the first count. Criminally negligent homicide was the other, were presented to the jury in the alternative, meaning you could only find a guilty verdict as to one. If they had found him guilty on manslaughter, they would have never moved to the charge that they determined today. But as we know from last week, they could not reach a verdict with respect to the manslaughter count. Now, finding somebody guilty on manslaughter requires two things. First, you have to prove that the person was reckless. And secondly, as I just mentioned, you have to find that the district attorney failed to prove to you as a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that the person had a lack of justification for their actions. And that's where, based on the notes that the jury sent the judge here, it seemed like they were hung up. The reason that's important is because that lack of justification issue also presents in a criminally negligent homicide count. So if the jury was unable to reach a resolution amongst themselves, finding that the DA proved beyond a reasonable doubt that there was no justification for Daniel Penny's actions, they couldn't find that as to manslaughter, fairly likely they're never going to find that as to the other count. It's none surprising to me, given what we saw happen last week, particularly after a weekend's break, which is never good for prosecutors, that this jury then came to a fairly quick conclusion, given how many hours they had spent beforehand, to acquit Daniel Penny.
Right, they had just...
Now let's go back and hear what she said again. This is crazy. What a great breakdown by this lady, by the way.
What's important is because that lack of justification issue also presents in a criminally negligent homicide count. So if the jury was unable to reach a resolution amongst themselves, finding that the DA proved beyond a reasonable doubt that there was no justification for Daniel Penny's actions, they couldn't find that as to manslaughter, fairly likely they're never going to find that as to the other count. It's none surprising to me, given what we saw happen last week, particularly after a week.
So pretty much, they couldn't, without manslaughter, you couldn't have criminal negligent homicide. Both of them were presented to the jury like, hey, you can only, the alternatives, you can only, if you go for this, you can only pick this. But then they remove the more heinous one out of the equation, which left the criminal negligent homicide, which could not be concluded without manslaughter. You can't be charged with criminal negligent homicide if the manslaughter didn't occur. You see what I'm saying? This is the manipulation that I'm talking about. Had they removed the criminal negligent homicide, they'd still be deliberating the case right now, and he'd possibly have the opportunity of being guilty. But since they removed that, you can't say that he did criminal negligent homicide if no manslaughter occurred. You get what I'm saying here? I'll even bring it back just a little bit, just so you understand what they're talking about here, because it's very important to break things down. And we could see that this is a definite manipulation of the definition of law.
If the jury was unable to reach a resolution amongst themselves, finding that the DA proved beyond a reasonable doubt that there was no justification for Daniel Penny's actions, they couldn't find that as to manslaughter, fairly likely they're never going to find that as to the other count. It's none surprising to me, given what we saw happen last week, particularly after a weekend's break, which is never good for prosecutors, that this jury then came to a fairly quick conclusion, given how many hours they had spent beforehand, to acquit Daniel Penny.
Right, they had...
And that goes to show that And they knew this as well because they weren't hung up on the criminally negligent homicide. They were hung up on the manslaughter. So that's where the fix was in, and that was dropped. And once you dropped that, you knew you had a not guilty verdict coming because that one wasn't the issue. You get what I'm saying? That's the problem with this case. And it seems like the judge added a little fragility into the case and manipulated it to the point to where he could get the non-guilty because he removed the manslaughter.
Just come back within the last couple of hours to begin deliberations on the second lesser charge. Again, the breaking news here, Daniel Penny found not guilty. But Lisa, we also know that Jordan Neely's family had filed, I believe, a civil suit in this case as well. Does the verdict in this case impact that?
Not necessarily. I mean, the law is rife with examples of people who are acquitted in criminal cases and yet find justice with respect to civil accountability.
Kyle Rittenhouse, right? Wasn't Kyle acquitted? He still got sued civilly, right? Yeah, just because you're acquitted don't mean that civil suit ain't coming. So, yeah, go ahead and continue to keep donating to your hero, Daniel Penny, because all that money is going right back to you know who.
I think the best example of that is with respect to Ron Goldman being the man who was murdered alongside Nicole Brown Simpson. Even though O.J. Simpson was never found criminally guilty for those two murders, Fred Goldman, the father, along with his daughter, then sued O.J. Simpson civilly and won a fairly large verdict with respect to civil liability for O.J. Simpson. There are many other examples of similar disjuncture between what happens in a criminal court and what happens when respect to a wrongful death action, for example, by a family.
And the Goldman guy, get some memorabilia from O.J., and then O.J. wanted it back and then tried to come back and strong-arm it and went to jail for it or something like that? I don't know. But yeah, there goes another example. Just because you get acquitted don't mean that civil suit ain't gonna hit you. He might be free, but he ain't gonna make no money ever again.
And so now, as this news is sinking in, Antonia, talk to us about what's happening outside the courthouse. We hear the protesters.
There are several dozen protesters here chanting outraged. The majority of the people here right outside the court are supporters of Jordan Neely, who have been talking about the need for mental health care, racial justice in New York City. I think our cameraman, Art, is going to try to swing so that you can see a little bit of what's happening here. At times, things have gotten tense this morning. Protesters have yelled at reporters here and asked us questions. I think they've been very anxious about what's happening inside. And also, at times, it's gotten so loud, in fact, that our team inside the courtroom shared with us that it became a discussion point among Daniel Penny's team and the judge. Penny's team came forward this morning before the verdict came back and raised concern that some of the remarks made by the protesters here could be interpreted as threatening to the jury, could sway their opinion in some way. The judge dismissed that, and it doesn't appear to have swayed them because the jury came back with a not guilty verdict pretty shortly after that.
That sounds like sway to me. If you've been deliberating for over a day on the charge, and then you have two charges, they drop the charge you're deliberating on, and in just 1 hour you come back. Kind of sounds like the jurors' hands are tied in a situation, right?
But it has been incredibly tense here. And again, Anna, as I said before, this is a case that has become this fault line in New York. It is a case that seems to have brought together so much discussion New Yorkers are having in their daily life about public safety, about security, about the availability of health care. For some people, they see connections between other recent cases. I covered the case of a man experiencing homelessness and mental illness who stabbed 3 New Yorkers just a few weeks ago. And so all of this seems to be converging at this critical moment. And Jordan Neely's story and the heartbreak people feel over it is certainly really the heart of it, Anna.
Lisa.
Bryn Spector, remember her? She stabbed her boyfriend 108 times and then blamed it on a marijuana psychosis and was let go. Yeah, we've seen plenty of examples when mental illness is okay for other folks, but it's not okay for everyone else. Now it's so dangerous. And all of this situation does is set a precedent. Now, hey, now everybody's going to be choking people out and claiming, hey, we were threatened by words. My life is in danger because you said something. Guess what? Now I have the right to choke you out, according to what happened with Daniel Penny.
Is that final?
As long as everyone else's life is in danger, I can choke you out when you call me the N-word.
Thought?
You know, Anna, one of the things that came across to me is the jury was not polled here in delivering their verdict. That means nobody asked the jurors one at a time to confirm that this is their verdict. That means we didn't get to hear from the people who are on this jury. And one thing that I'm really curious about is whether or not there are people on the jury who feel like they want to speak out. Because, again, if they could not reach a unanimous verdict to find him guilty, based on their prior experiences, they may have concluded that they were never going to reach a unanimous verdict. That doesn't mean there weren't people on this jury who would have voted to find Daniel Penny guilty, and particularly given how fraught this case is, given what else is going on in the city of New York, as Antonio was just very vividly describing. I'll be curious to see if any jurors come forward and want to tell their story to folks like us.
Yeah. Breaking news.
And I doubt that's going to happen because the judge is probably going to gag order those jurors and prevent them from being able to reach out to media and explain not only their side of the story, but the process that occurred during. So I wouldn't hold my breath on that situation. My opinion on this situation is, of course, I knew this would happen. I personally prefer the civil suit more because that right there is going to prevent the man from being able to continue life efficiently. And once I saw the removal of the main one, sorry, this energy drink is a little gassy, but once I saw the removal of the main charge, I knew the fix was in, because that was the charge they were deadlocked on. And instead of them being allowed to continue that deadlock process, which is supposed to be normal, it was removed, and it was softer safeguards were given for them to deliberate on, just to make everyone feel good about the process, instead of actually taking as much time possible to come to the right conclusion in the situation. And that's what it's all about at the end of the day, fragility, because none of that should have ever been allowed. And if you knew charge B is effective by charge A, you remove charge B, you keep charge A. You don't get rid of charge A to make it easier to get charge B. I mean, as far as I'm concerned. So let me know what you think in the comments about this. Make sure you definitely leave a like, a sub. What's the fix in? Did you expect this? Is Daniel Penny a hero for this? Or is it like I said, did he only set precedent for this? Because, yeah, I mean, I definitely knew this was going to happen personally. So it's not like I was expecting a guilty. You know, I know what the country stands for. I know the systematic injustices that incur. I know the preferential treatment that is done for everyone else in this country to get ahead. And things like this help bring it to more of a light. So the end result long term for this only brings black people closer. So, I mean, short-term wins for long-term losses. That's how I see it. But anyways, let me know what you think in the comments. Make sure, like I said, you hit that like, sub, and we'll be back with more later. And like always, deuces.